The Making of a Luna. Previous episodes are available on the playlist. You can also visit our website for your favorite stories. A link is provided in the video description. Episode 5. Consequently, when Misha expressed dissatisfaction with the cold, the other men and Elara did not respond in any manner. They departed from the vicinity of the creek, their mission to forage for sustenance. The substantial pack required the procurement of approximately 2 or 3 deer daily to satiate their nutritional needs. As dusk fell, the group concluded that, while remaining near the campsite was a viable option, the nighttime hours would present unique challenges. However, if they were to employ their wolf vision, the nocturnal environment would not pose a significant obstacle. As they ventured deeper into the forest, they successfully hunted their first deer. Elara's arrow successfully penetrated the deer's vitreous cavity, resulting in a swift and painless demise. This action was considered an ethical imperative, given the minimal harm inflicted on the animal. Following a thorough survey of the area to ensure the absence of potential prey, the subjects proceeded to vacate their respective hiding places and congregate in a central location. It is remarkable that this is yet another successful execution. "You are an extraordinary alpha." One of the subjects expressed enthusiasm for the idea, a sentiment that was shared by the others. While the subjects had previously observed the author's performance, each new instance was met with astonishment. In response, Elara nodded calmly and proceeded to follow the scent of another deer. The absence of facial expression, which had initially impeded their ability to comprehend her sentiments, no longer occupied their thoughts. The men exhibited no response to her lack of response, they had become habituated to her personality. They advanced at a deliberate pace, tracing the tracks that had not yet been obscured by the accumulated snow. The trailing wolf, exhibiting the characteristics of a rank, exhibited a distinct reluctance to engage with the prey. As the werewolves traversed the snow-covered landscape in the late hours of the day, their senses were attuned to the faint scent of another deer. For humans, it would be challenging to discern the animal's position amidst the rapid descent of snowflakes. However, during nocturnal conditions, the animal could effortlessly ascertain its location with the same level of ease as during the diurnal hours. They methodically assumed positions, endeavoring to avoid alarming the creature. They concealed themselves behind snow-covered shrubbery and trees. The subject's attire, predominantly white or at least light in color, served to blend into their surroundings, thereby achieving near-perfect camouflage. In a state of silent contemplation, they ascertained the individual who possessed the optimal vantage point from which to propel the arrow. After conducting a survey of the situation, Elara ascertained that a gentleman was in a more advantageous position than herself. She then signaled her acknowledgement of this fact by nodding her head in the indicated direction. The pack member comprehended the silent message and reciprocated with a nod, simultaneously readying themselves to discharge their weapon. He proceeded to extend the bow with measured deliberation, maintaining a steady breath hold. He was determined to maintain the firmness of his hand, ensuring that it did not tremble. Elara had targeted the head on each occasion, but the execution of such a precise shot was challenging. Recognizing his inability to match her proficiency, he sought to ensure a swift demise for his target by aiming for the abdomen, in proximity to the heart. He was on the verge of releasing his arrow when he was abruptly interrupted. The deer, taken aback by the sudden auditory stimulus, hastily sought refuge by entering its hiding place. The auditory signal was identified as the resonant utterance of a female voice. The following assertion is made: Imperium, Cielritus, Vires numquam relincuntur. The woman who spoke in a charming tone and an unknown language is of particular interest. Elara's thoughts only wandered for a few seconds, during which she attempted to recognize the content of the utterance and the precise language, which appeared somewhat familiar to her, before deciphering the meaning of the words she perceived. Deprive them of power, speed, and strength. She articulated the translated phrase in a deliberate manner. This phrase was not merely a phrase, it was, in fact, a spell. A witch was casting a spell upon her, and she quickly thought of the next course of action. The subject vocalized with a marked increase in volume, employing her alpha voice for the second time in her life. Her typical calm tone underwent a transformation, becoming more powerful and more befitting of a leader. We are under attack. Gather around now. Her voice resonated loudly in the nocturnal silence, rendering any attempt at discreet communication futile due to the probable surveillance of the assailants. The objective of the incantation was to immobilize the subjects and deplete them of the capacity to resist the subsequent events. She anticipated that the Alpha's directive would congregate them prior to the manifestation of the spell's effects. It is unclear whether the others comprehended the nature of the spell. In order to avoid any potential misinterpretation of her words and a subsequent delay in their response, she sought to ensure that they fully understood the gravity of the situation. To this end, she employed Sable's strength to bolster her words. Following her departure from her previous pack, Sable had maintained a relatively peripheral presence in her thoughts. On occasion, she would respond, although her voice was typically not audible. Consequently, she had not utilized Sable's wolf power for a considerable period. However, she was still capable of employing her strength, for which she expressed gratitude. Naira was also an alpha, but she was not certain that Naira's voice could overpower the spell. Naira would never assume control over Elara's body without her consent. At this juncture, she would address the issue from the perspective of her human aspect. The other werewolves congregated around her swiftly, drawn to her words. The members were left unresponsive, having been rendered speechless by the ease with which she had compelled them to submit to her will. However, recognizing the gravity of their circumstances, they did not attempt to resist or reconsider her guidance. All participants were aware that the exercise was designed to facilitate bonds among the diverse student body, despite the challenging conditions. These vessels were not designed to withstand unexpected attacks, particularly from individuals believed to possess magical powers. This forest, despite its considerable size, was situated within the vicinity of the royal palace. The presence of witches or other supernatural entities was strictly prohibited within this area without explicit authorization from the royal authority. Consequently, it is reasonable to infer that the subjects could only assume that the situation was not a drill, but rather a real-life endangering scenario. Concurrently, the spell's incantation yielded the anticipated outcome, prompting the last werewolf to hasten toward the group. The subjects reported a sensation of increasing weight, which culminated in most of them collapsing on their knees. Elara maintained her upright position, engaging in combat with a pair of formidable werewolves. However, these creatures began to exhibit signs of fatigue. In a matter of moments, the spell reached its full potency, compelling even the more formidable werewolves to genuflect. A subsequent incantation was uttered, as a white, lustrous mist shimmered amidst the falling snowflakes, thereby reinforcing the initial spell and immobilizing them. Notwithstanding the perilous circumstances, the scene was indeed a captivating one. The scene before them was a true manifestation of winter's enchantment. Elara, too, appeared indifferent, maintaining her footing with effort. However, her concentration on countering the spells led to a swift transformation in her appearance. Her eyes darkened instantaneously, and her fangs and claws became sharp. Her breathing was labored and rapid, and white vapor could be seen emanating from her mouth. Her pulse and heartbeat accelerated. The other werewolves endeavored to mobilize, attempting to metamorphose into their lupin forms. However, these efforts proved futile, as they were unable to alter their position in any way. She disregarded the auditory and physical signs of struggle emanating from the intruders, instead focusing on discerning their movements and sounds. However, she did not exhibit any movement, either in her feet or her head, in an attempt to conceal the fact that, with greater effort, she would have been capable of doing so. The enemy was unaware of her presence, yet she was in plain sight and vulnerable, as she was the only one capable of attacking. The sole benefit was that her strength was a mystery to all and the spell's effect on her was not as pronounced as anticipated. She was reluctant to divulge this information without first ascertaining the identity of her interlocutor. Well. What is the nature of the phenomenon under consideration? A girl remains standing. This outcome was wholly unanticipated. A male's voice, characterized by its raspiness, articulated the sentiment. As she advanced, the sound of her footsteps on the frozen ground was accompanied by a high-pitched screeching noise. Gradually, she was able to discern the contours of the male subject as he drew nearer. The dark silhouette gradually transformed into a clear image, allowing her to make out his features. He was followed by at least 10 others. It is noteworthy that she would have never anticipated that these individuals would engage in collusion with witches. Based on an analysis of their attire and armaments, it was determined that the individuals in question were indeed hunters. The following is a list of key elements that must be included in any discussion of this subject. It is evident that this is an occurrence that does not manifest on a daily basis. A voice of a deep timbre resonated with a hint of derisive intonation. The individual who appeared to be the leader of the hunters was estimated to be between the ages of 45 and 50 years. Attired in dark garments, accentuated by a black puffed vest and a fur hat, the subject bore an uncanny resemblance to Iron Fang. The remaining individuals who materialized from behind the man were attired in a similar fashion. A distinguishing characteristic that sets these individuals apart from conventional hunters is the presence of wolfbane bullets within their arsenal, which consists of an assortment of firearms. It is highly probable that the soldiers had applied wolfbane to the small knives suspended from their thighs. "Chief, how is it possible that she is still standing? Was not the spell cast by a practitioner of witchcraft considered to be absolute?" A query was posed to a young individual who emerged from between the lifeless, frozen trees, their countenance expressing a sense of perplexity. The aforementioned assertion is indeed substantiated by the available evidence. The chief, in a state of contemplation, swiftly oriented his weapon toward Elara, adopting a defensive posture. This action implied a potential assessment of whether the spell had also influenced her. However, even in the direct line of fire of the weapon, she remained stationary. Not even her eyes blinked. Fortunately, her fangs were obscured by the closed mouth, her claws concealed by the sleeves of her white coat, and her dark eyes could only be perceived with close proximity. The aforementioned facts, when taken together, created a situation in which it was difficult for ordinary people to easily perceive her partially transformed form during the hours of darkness. It appears that she experienced a moment of sudden immobilization. It is conceivable that the second spell was cast upon her before the first one. It is reasonable to assume that any werewolf would be compelled to comply with the demands of a sentry wielding a rifle adorned with a wolf bane, a weapon designed for lethal purposes. The older man calculated. It is evident that the subject has comprehended the matter at hand. The young man, who had been previously unaware, acknowledged this, but nevertheless found the situation peculiar. The second spell was cast subsequent to the initial one. If there were still individuals remaining to engage with the spells, would it not be the alpha of the pack, a highly ranked member? However, his lack of experience relative to that of his superior led him to accept the latter's assertions unquestioningly. It must be noted that the subject was female. Therefore, it is difficult to understand how she could have possibly fought against it. As observed, approximately 10 wolves were immobilized on their knees, exhibiting an inability to initiate movement. In response, the subjects adopted a state of relaxation, concurrently lowering their guard. As was anticipated, the presence of the two witches resulted in a multitude of benefits. It has been observed that the percentage of captured wolves increased from 10% to 20% over the past year, and more recently, this figure has reached 100%. Their effectiveness was such that they even ventured into the forest of the Wolf King, a perilous undertaking that would typically be considered suicide. The witches were tasked with the freezing of the wolves. The wolves were subsequently loaded into trucks and transported away from the site. The duration of the endeavor would not exceed 2 hours. Moreover, the source had assured him that the only being capable of discerning an anomaly so swiftly as to impede their scheme, the king, was not in his palace that night. Typically, even if this method of hunting proved effective, it was challenging to launch an attack on a standard pack. Even the smallest pack known to them contained approximately 1,000 wolves, and the spell's efficacy was insufficient to ensure the capture of all wolves within the designated area. The capture of a single individual, representing merely a fraction of the group, would inevitably provoke profound indignation among the remaining members. This collective outrage would inevitably result in a unified response, characterized by a swift and decisive execution of the offending individual. In the previous year, the organization primarily focused on rescuing stray animals, yet the number of animals they were able to rescue was insufficient to achieve their objectives. In order to ascertain the nature of the recent exercise that transpired in conjunction with the king's recent absence, it is imperative to consider the substantial congregation of young, easily manipulable werewolves. This phenomenon can be regarded as a fortuitous occurrence. A secondary benefit was that apprehending the werewolves under the jurisdiction of the monarch would diminish his authority. Each group of students was assigned a litter of pups from packs located across the globe. It would be advantageous to provoke the werewolves into a state of insurrection and divert their attention from the king for a considerable period. At this juncture, as the non-combatant members of your ad hoc assembly are being apprehended, it would be prudent to initiate an interrogation. The chief of the hunters, exhibiting a state of composure, descended to one of the werewolves, which appeared to be less formidable and more amenable to interrogation. Typically, the werewolves were rendered completely silent under the influence of the spell. However, the Iron Fang wore a small amulet around his neck that partially nullified the effect of the second spell. Despite the fact that the last-ranked werewolf, who was still accompanied by the deer, was unable to move, he was still compelled to respond to the questions, regardless of his personal desires. To which of the males present does the title of Alpha pertain? He inquired, seemingly indifferent to Elara's presence, about the subject of the artifact. The young wolf was frightened by the malevolent voice and incensed by his inability to respond to the attack. Nevertheless, his sense of solidarity with his pack prevented him from responding truthfully to the inquiry. The subject indicated a desire to fabricate a falsehood. However, the amulet also had the effect of compelling individuals to respond to inquiries with veracity. Consequently, the truth was revealed instead of a falsehood. Elara is the Alpha. The utterance of the words was effortless, and even the speaker was perplexed by his own words. It is evident that the utterance of Elara was perceived by the subject, who was subsequently addressed as Elara. The name was repeated, and the Iron Fang's eyes grew wide as he swiftly lifted his gaze toward the sole female present between them. Subsequently, after a brief pause of approximately half a second, the speaker resumed their discourse. This observation is noteworthy and merits further examination. This observation provides a more nuanced explanation for the young female pup's continued standing. Elara's body was increasingly covered in snow, with minute snowflakes adorning her face and hair. As the fragments of sculpted ice gradually melted on the warm skin of the werewolf girl, minute droplets of water began to adorn her beautiful face. The water's appearance could be misinterpreted as sweat, a consequence of the evident fright experienced in response to the situation. It is possible that the hunter's words influenced her behavior, yet she did not respond to them. The act of venturing into the domain of His Highness's forest was indicative of a significant occurrence. It had already come to her attention that their objective was to apprehend them, as opposed to taking them out. It is imperative to consider the circumstances under which hunters would not engage in the act of killing a werewolf at the earliest sign of lycanthropy. The rationale behind the necessity to apprehend the subjects in question while they are still alive is not readily apparent. It is possible that she could ascertain additional information. It is evident that she exercised caution and restraint, cognizant of the fact that their objective was merely to apprehend them. In the event that assistance was already en route and she did not await its arrival, what consequences might have ensued if it had resulted in the demise of some of the werewolves? It was possible for her to wait a brief additional period. The absence of action on her part was contingent upon the continuation of discourse by the hunters. However, the question remains, how can a female wolf ascend to the position of alpha? What is her rank, and what type of student is she? Upon posing the inquiry once more to the Iron Fang, he exhibited a profound sense of curiosity. It would be prudent to inquire further before the arrival of the trucks transporting the other werewolves. Elara is a third-rank wolf and a student at Moonlight. The words escaped his mouth once more, despite the fact that on this occasion, the werewolf was not inclined to respond. All the hunters who had been listening were taken aback by this piece of information, which prompted them to listen more intently to the interrogation. The focal point of the discourse was the interaction between the two parties. The subject is a moonlight student and a third-ranked werewolf. This specimen represents the first documented capture of its kind. It was evident that the necessary steps were not taken to ensure that the relevant parties were informed of the inclusion of moonlight students in the exercise. It is evident that the wolves are incapable of performing this task correctly. It can be posited that the apprehension of a moonlight student serves to mitigate their transgressions to a certain extent. The older man emitted a sigh, oscillating his head from side to side in a gesture of disapproval. "Do not interfere with our alpha." The young werewolf confirmed his displeasure with a show of indignation, his teeth gritted in a display of anger. He expressed profound displeasure with the individual within his mind. In response to inquiries, he demonstrated an innate ability to formulate a coherent response, even in circumstances where he had not deliberately sought to do so. However, when attempting to articulate his thoughts and feelings autonomously, he encountered significant challenges. It was a considerable effort for him to initiate verbal communication, and he could only manage to utter a limited number of words. "Oh." It appears that the wolves in question exhibit behaviors consistent with a high degree of protective instinct. With a smirk of satisfaction, the Iron Fang addressed the futile attempt to retaliate, observing that the other werewolves were also attempting to move angrily. The hunter's derisive utterances provoked a derisive response from the observers, with some even whistling in apparent agreement. The chief of the hunters, his smile widening in response, rose to his feet and advanced toward Elara. Upon closer inspection, he observed that her eyes were dark, akin to the night sky. However, he remained unperturbed, as she had not exhibited any movement throughout this period. In his preconceived notions, werewolves were regarded as creatures of impulsive behavior. It is evident that, in the absence of the ability to move, a werewolf would have perpetrated an attack on 100 occasions by this point. Historically, werewolves have not exhibited the capacity to remain stationary and assess the situation before engaging in combat. It stands to reason that Elara would hold a similar perspective. The man's apparent oversight regarding the nature of the werewolves before him is noteworthy. These creatures, it should be recalled, are not the same as the rogue werewolves the man has previously encountered and pursued. They were pack-born and raised werewolves who exhibited a greater propensity toward calm and rationality. What a magnificent specimen of the Canis lupus familiaris! It is interesting to consider whether the subject would be classified as a third-rank wolf. The subject's appearance is described as delectable. What is your opinion on this matter, gentlemen? He articulated this sentiment with a subtle licking of his lips. The hunters perceived the lewd remark and intensified their smirk. The inquiry posed sought to ascertain whether an opportunity to participate would be presented. A number of individuals exhibited a marked enthusiasm for the endeavor, readily embracing the opportunity to participate. It must be noted that the initial experience is of the utmost importance. Only after that. Iron Fang's grin indicated his consent, and he lowered his guard even further, placing his rifle on his back rather than in his hands. The truck's arrival coincided with his continued observation of the stationary Elara. He had even raised his hand to caress her face, but stopped himself when the other hunters got down from the trucks to load their prey. "Greetings, Superior. Would it be permissible to also take the deer? I propose that we partake in a culinary experience involving barbecued foods this evening." The young Iron Fang, positioned adjacent to the final ranked werewolf, inquired with a sense of elation. It is evident that the aforementioned statement is of a favorable nature. The chief, who had been distracted, averted his gaze from Elara, directing his attention toward the young Iron Fang. However, his response was abruptly halted as Elara's hand was already firmly positioned on his neck. Upon regaining his composure and registering the sensation of being restrained, he became aware that his feet were only minimally in contact with the ground. Elara was cognizant of the fact that she had delayed for as long as was feasible, however, in the distance, she was unable to discern the sounds of assistance. Pending transportation would further impede the potential for a successful rescue operation, as it would complicate the logistics of the rescue mission and potentially hinder the timely extraction of the individual in question and the other subjects. Consequently, she resolved to place her trust in her own strength and that of her wolves. The subjects provided her with assistance on a previous occasion when she was assaulted by individuals of a malevolent nature. Despite her inexperience in dealing with hunters, she was resolute in her determination to survive and ensure the survival of her pack. In the absence of external assistance, she would serve as the source of that assistance. Chief! The young Iron Fang vociferated in alarm, observing his superior being restrained in the air by the female wolf. He found the situation to be utterly incredulous. It was imperative that she remain immobile. It is perplexing to observe the remarkable agility exhibited by the subject, which appears to exceed the visual capacity of the observer. Notwithstanding the absence of prior experience with third-rank wolves, the high-ranked wolves should still be at least marginally decelerated, provided that the spell is unable to completely inhibit their movement. However, she exhibited no discernible response to the situation. The other hunters also directed their gaze toward their chief, their expressions conveying alarm. They were on the verge of apprehending the werewolves, and thus, their attention was not directed towards the older man and Elara. Upon observing the individual currently endeavoring to extricate Elara's arm, the others promptly elevated their weapons. However, they were unable to discharge their weapons, as the chief's hand was firmly holding her arm in place. Notwithstanding the fact that the wolfbane did not directly cause the death of their chief, the bullet containing the aforementioned substance still had the potential to do so. It was imperative that they exercise caution and refrain from hasty action. "Permit the man to depart, you beast of a man, or we will discharge our firearms at him." One of the hunters issued an authoritative order. He was under the impression that the situation was being effectively managed. The female subjects are instructed to disembark from the vehicle and depart. "If you do not want your chief's neck broken like a twig." She articulated her statement in a composed and unemotional manner. Despite the threats made against her, she remained steadfast in her resolve, refusing to succumb to intimidation. Despite the potential for discord with her peers, she maintained her position as the alpha of the group. The primary function of the alpha was to ensure the protection of the group. The inquiry posed was of a rhetorical nature, encapsulated by the word how. The sole word that emerged from the chief's mouth as he experienced a sudden loss of breath. He attempted to disengage himself from her grip by applying pressure with his hands on her right arm, however, he was unable to dislodge even a single fingernail from the skin on his neck. She exhibited a level of physical hardness and resilience that defied his attempts at escape. The subject's black eyes and calm, cold demeanor instilled in the observer a profound sense of fear, the likes of which had never been experienced before. The beautiful ethereal girl that was currently before him was on the verge of actually killing him. It is evident that he should have maintained a constant state of vigilance. However, it is equally remarkable that he could not have anticipated the extent of her strength. This revelation provoked a profound response from the hunters, who found themselves even more astonished. Despite being confronted with a situation involving 20 guns pointed at her, her voice did not exhibit any signs of fear. It is estimated that a single bullet would result in injury, 2 bullets would lead to critical condition, 3 bullets would render the body unable to regenerate, and 4 bullets would cause instantaneous death. However, she displayed no fear in the presence of 20 potential bullets, or even more if the firing continued. The situation was characterized by a state of impasse, yet she persisted in her assertion, this time with a heightened degree of intensity. Allow the girls to disembark. In the event that the aforementioned conditions are not met, the potential for lethal force will be exercised. The allotted time for this task is 5 seconds. 1. She elevated her voice, thereby exposing her protruded fangs, and emitted a menacing snarl directed at them. She demonstrated a resolute determination to persist in her struggle until the ultimate outcome of death. She elevated their chief to a position that exceeded the level of his feet, thereby demonstrating the sincerity of her assertions. Her left hand was elevated, meticulously enumerating the seconds. As she articulated the word 1, the chief, who was firmly grasped by her hand, observed her palm. It is possible that the other party lacks the same level of information as the first, yet his sources provided him with a substantial amount of detail, including information regarding watchers. Despite his lack of prior exposure to such phenomena, he demonstrated an ability to discern the distinctive mark of an alpha among a group of watchers. This signified that they were in the presence of a werewolf who was not ranked below that of the Werewolf Council. Subsequent to this alarming realization, a further disquieting notion ensued. It is evident that such an encounter would not result in a favorable outcome for them. It was evident that they had been wronged, he concluded. The number 2 is indicated by the numeral 2. Elara articulated her enumeration with marked emphasis, her voice uninterrupted and unwavering. Despite her efforts to maintain composure, her heart was racing, and she was unable to conceal her feelings. It is imperative that assistance be provided in order to cultivate fortitude. She sought assistance from the only individuals capable of providing support at that time, her wolves. I am here, Elara. Naira was acknowledged without hesitation. Sable's inability to respond further was evident, yet she perceived an enhancement in her aura. She was convinced that the power emanating from her surpassed that of Naira's, and thus, it was reasonable to conclude that the white wolf was providing her with strength. It is imperative that she engage in a meaningful dialogue with her. Sable had always been reserved, but she had never been as reticent as she was during the previous few months. The dialogue would transpire at a subsequent time, contingent upon her survival. Utilizing the peripheral vision of her eyes, she surveyed the other werewolves. Their apparent immobility was consistent with the hunter's predictions, suggesting that they would not be killed until the hunter's objectives were met. Therefore, even if she were to act independently, the other werewolves would remain secure. They would not be considered an immediate menace, and thus their survival would be ensured. The number 3 was indicated by the utterance of the word 3. The subject continued to speak in a raised voice, displaying a strong sense of determination. Concurrently, she raised another finger, clawed and extended, in the air. The atmosphere was marked by a state of heightened tension. The hunters experienced a state of perplexity regarding the appropriate course of action. They were unable to lower their weapons, as they had already discerned the rapidity with which she was moving. It is reasonable to assume that she would neutralize one or two of them until they could terminate her, and no one would want to be in that one or two people. Nevertheless, the decision to leave the chief behind was a contentious one. He was the mastermind of the operation, and his absence would undoubtedly result in the overtaking of the group by other hunters. It is also noteworthy that he was the one who exercised control over the witches. It was evident that the audience was unresponsive to her verbal attempts at communication. In response, she increased the intensity with which she held the chief's neck with her claws, causing him to gasp for air, though he was unable to do so. It is possible that she calculated that this approach would enhance her persuasiveness. Alternatively, it is plausible that her behavior was a spontaneous reaction to a state of anxiety. Nevertheless, the result was, regrettably, the inverse of what was intended. A single, audible sound was produced as a bullet was discharged from one of the riffles. The young iron fang that had been positioned by the deer had lost his composure and, while trembling due to a terrifying fright, had accidentally pulled the trigger, thereby putting an unwitting end to the stalemate situation. Upon perceiving the injury on her left abdomen and the swift absorption of the wolf's bane into her system, which elicited sensations of discomfort unlike any she had previously experienced, Elara reflexively clenched her clawed hand, unintentionally causing the fracture of the iron fang's neck. This incident marked the first instance of lethal violence perpetrated by the subject, despite her lack of intention to do so. Typically, her own actions would have resulted in a state of perplexity and immobilization due to the traumatic incident. However, the circumstances and the adrenaline surge within her body prompted her to persist in deliberating the subsequent course of action, rather than succumbing to a state of discomposure. It was imperative that she not expend mental energy contemplating the life she had relinquished. It was evident that, given the chief's demise, his status as a hostage had become moot. In a hasty maneuver, she propelled the lifeless body in the direction of the hunters, in the hope that it would create a momentary distraction, thereby potentially diminishing their numbers. 2 hunters were struck by the older man's corpse, which was of considerable build, and which the older man had thrown with considerable force in their direction. This caused the hunters to crash into a nearby tree, after which they lost consciousness. The duration of her remaining time until the inevitable cessation of bodily functions was uncertain, as the response to the wolf's bane differed among wolves. It is possible that she possessed a greater amount of time than that which she had acquired through her coursework, a circumstance that might have been influenced by the presence of her 2 wolves. However, she was not willing to take any risks. The element of time assumed paramount importance, prompting a hasty withdrawal under the protection of the densely snow-covered foliage. Consequently, she disengaged from the werewolves who remained prostrate. She recognized that if she endeavored to engage in combat while surrounded by them, the probability of being struck by a stray bullet would be significantly increased. It is evident that the hunters would not endeavor to actively kill them. However, while engaged in combat with her, she expressed reservations regarding their prudence in the presence of creatures that they typically exterminate without hesitation. She evaded the bullets by maneuvering erratically through the foliage. The initial gunshot prompted a collective response, as they all began firing in her direction. The subject contemplated shifting in her wolf form, however, her human form was significantly smaller, thereby facilitating a more discreet presence. Moreover, the effects of wolfsbane would hinder the subject's ability to shift. Furthermore, the size of her wolf form would render it more susceptible to attacks. Circling around the targets at maximum velocity, she retrieved the bow she had affixed to her back, loaded it with arrows, and discharged it rapidly, successfully targeting and neutralizing 5 hunters in succession. She could have persisted in her course, continuing to maneuver through the arboreal terrain and thereby neutralizing an even greater number of hunters. However, due to the depletion of her arrows, she was compelled to relinquish her bow and resort to unarmed combat. Swiftly altering her trajectory, she evaded the hunter's arrows by maneuvering erratically through the snow-covered pine forest. She then strategically positioned herself behind 2 other hunters. As she elevated her foot, making contact with the dorsal region of one of the creatures, she ensured that his corpse fell in the direction of another Iron Fang, who was in the process of discharging a firearm at her. Subsequently, without hesitation, she grasped the second Iron Fang, which had been in proximity to the first, by its neck and rapidly pulled it to the side, resulting in a crack. In the absence of other hunters in proximity, she merely propelled his body in the opposite direction before expeditiously withdrawing. The hunters had already ascertained her position after the brief attack, however, the swiftness of a high-ranking werewolf was not to be underestimated. She had already positioned herself between the trees once more, as the fires were ignited. Her primary advantages in this scenario were the darkness and her remarkable speed, which enabled her to outpace her opponents. They proceeded to discharge their weapons in the general direction in which she was last observed, yet this action merely served to mask the auditory indicators of her departure from the immediate vicinity, as she discreetly traversed another section of the forest and expeditiously apprehended an additional Iron Fang by grasping him firmly by the back. On this occasion, the female assailant lured the Iron Fang into a state of darkness, subsequently employing a tree as a means to restrain the creature and inflict a severe injury upon its spinal column. Following this act, the assailant made her escape. Due to the uncertainty surrounding the efficacy of the method, she was unable to employ the same approach as previously. In order to maintain the element of surprise, she was required to adjust her movements with each iteration. Despite the element of surprise, she was still struck by a stray bullet. In their state of heightened excitement, the hunters discharged their weapons at their companion, who was attempting to utilize her elongated nails to penetrate the back of another Iron Fang. The second bullet's wolfsbane caused her to falter, and she did not retreat in time in the dark. The half-step she failed to execute in her rearward movement represented a potential opportunity for a third bullet to strike her, and a fourth. Following the fifth shot, Elara had already been defeated. Cease immediately. This is sufficient. The individual subsequently designated as the primary administrator, the chief's principal assistant, made the following statement while the subject was already positioned on the frigid ground. The bullets in their possession were of a particularly challenging nature to manufacture, and the process resulted in the loss of human lives. The subject's limited financial resources necessitated a judicious approach to the utilization of these resources. Due to the assistance rendered by the witches, it was anticipated that their utilization would not be necessary. It is noteworthy that the team's performance in the tournament has been less than optimal, which is surprising given their previous successes. The firing of the rifle ceased, and no further inquiry was made into the circumstances surrounding her demise. The seventh bullet that struck her while she was prone on the snow-covered ground did not provoke even the slightest flinch. This was indicative of their success in eliminating her, at least in their own estimation. The armed group ceased their fire but did not lower their weapons. There was a residual fear of her suddenly sprinting on her feet again. Despite the administration of 7 doses of wolfsbane, there was no definitive confirmation of its lethality. The werewolf in question instilled in them a profound sense of trepidation, surpassing even that evoked by the legendary werewolf king. Consequently, it was not surprising that, despite being assured of her demise, they still perceived the possibility of her resilience. For a brief period, they maintained a stationary position. However, they ultimately found themselves unable to persist in that state for any lengthier duration. As time expired, the group faced the imminent threat of apprehension by the patrol werewolves if they failed to depart promptly. The second in command advanced toward her with measured steps. The woman had fallen onto her side, with her face oriented in the direction of the man. Her tresses, which had become disheveled, reclined on the snow-covered ground, partially obscuring her countenance. A modest portion of the fair skin was visible, yet it was sufficient to evoke a profound sense of admiration for its aesthetic appeal. The subject's appearance was reminiscent of a snow fairy, a comparison that was made due to the subject's striking physical beauty. He exhibited a dismissive gesture, cognizant of the incident that had transpired moments earlier, wherein his superior had exhibited a lack of caution in her presence. Exhibiting caution and attentiveness to auditory and motor stimuli, the subject advanced to a proximity of 2 feet, at which point the absence of vital signs was ascertained. It was evident that she was assessing the situation based on the expanding pool of blood that was gradually encircling the immediate environment. Given the severity of her wounds, which were still exuding a dark red liquid, the effects of the wolfsbane, which prevented regeneration, and the amount of blood near her body, which was causing the white, translucent snow to turn a bright red, it was certain that she would perish. At least half of her body's blood, if not more, was present, continuously flowing. Contrary to expectations, Elara survived the gunshot wounds and significant blood loss. The subject reported perceiving the movement of the other party as if she were experiencing a dream state. The distance between them appeared to be considerable, yet the subject reported a complete absence of physical mobility. The subject was visibly frightened and lacked the physical capability to respond, evidenced by a marked decrease in pulse and respiratory rate. The subject was positioned on the frigid white expanse of snow, yet she did not perceive the cold sensation. Her physical response was minimal, as the effects of the wolfsbane had completely numbed her. On a psychological level, she was experiencing distress due to her inability to actualize her aspirations. Her life had just barely begun a few months prior, she had just started to work towards her goals, but it seemed as if it would all come to an end. Contrary to the conventional belief that the soul of the deceased experiences a moment of reflection prior to physical expiration, she instead grappled with profound trepidation and a profound sense of bereavement, encompassing the loss of all that held significance in her life. She reflected on her brother and her new acquaintances. Automatically, the final image that came to her mind was that of the werewolf king. Elara! Elara! Naira vocalized her request with urgency, but was unable to respond, even if she had been capable of formulating a single word in her mind. Naira's observation of her companion's state of helplessness induced a state of despondency, as it became evident that their existence was nearing its conclusion. "I am here. Do not worry." Sable, the white wolf who had been absent, finally exhibited encouragement. Naira experienced a profound sense of relief and emotional release, as if a substantial weight had been removed from her chest, due to the reassuring voice and words of the figure who had consistently provided her with protection. Sable's role as a dependable figure within the group is noteworthy, as she has consistently demonstrated a mature and supportive demeanor. Sable. Elara's response is notably absent, and her mental state appears to be deteriorating. She promptly notified the frightened individuals. It is imperative to ascertain whether Sable would be capable of providing assistance once more in a manner similar to her previous contributions. The circumstances were at their most unfavorable. It is acceptable. It is imperative to recognize that the utilization of conventional means, such as the administration of wolfsbane and the deployment of ammunition, is insufficient to neutralize our capabilities. Proceed with a re-examination of her internal cognitive processes. Hurry. Sable momentarily appeased Naira before requesting that she assume her position. There was insufficient time to inform Naira of her imminent actions, and there was also no necessity to do so. As was typical, Naira did not inquire about Sable's motivations. Instead, she promptly complied with the instructions she had received. "Elara, I am aware that you lack the necessary strength, but I request your cooperation in this matter, as we previously did for the seer test." Sable finally communicated with the human side, who had only been an observer to their interaction. Her abilities were rapidly deteriorating. Elara's auditory perception of the impending event preceded the onset of her loss of consciousness. Utilizing the residual energy available to her, she exerted a concerted effort to focus her attention. Within the confines of her consciousness, in the region typically occupied by wolves, a white, splendid wolf was observed seated with its paws positioned in an upright position before her. Her physical presence was imposing, and her grey eyes glimmered as she awaited Elara in a state of composure. Due to the spatial constraints, she was unable to move closer, as she was already positioned in the central area. From a distance, she observed Elara's approach, albeit with considerable difficulty. Despite this effort, she found herself unable to provide any assistance, despite her own internal recognition of Elara's external appearance, which indicated a state of profound mental distress. Her white attire was in a state of disrepair, marred by blood that had seeped through the fabric and accumulated on the floor. A small droplet of blood was also observed on her lips. The subject gradually and methodically advanced until she arrived at a position in front of the white wolf that was conducive to collapse. It was evident that she appeared diminutive in comparison to Sable, as indicated by their respective heights. Despite her own standing, Sable maintained a taller stature. While in a supine position, the subject's appearance was reminiscent of a child. Sable then rose to her feet and, with her proboscis, approached Elara's countenance, offering solace. "Your performance has been satisfactory up to this point. Leave it to me from this point forward." Concurrently, a reversal occurred in their respective positions. Sable was in the location where Elara had previously collapsed, while Elara was in Sable's previous location. Sable, having exhausted all options, chose to abandon the endeavor and instead embarked on a hasty retreat, pursuing the trajectory from which Elara had originally emerged. She would seek legal recourse against them for the forced eviction. The situation was already dire, and the presence of these hunters only exacerbated it. The wolf, a majestic creature, was incensed by the perceived threat to its domain and was determined to defend it. The exterior body remained stationary during the interaction. The presence of the claws, fangs, and the blackness covering her whole eyes had already ceased to exist by the time she lost consciousness, as she lacked the ability to maintain them. The entity in question exhibited a physical resemblance to a human body in a state of normal functionality. Concurrently, the second-in-command issued a directive to the remaining hunters, instructing them to swiftly amass the werewolves and prepare to depart. The persistent challenges would undoubtedly alert the werewolves charged with the protection of the students. The creature's delayed intervention was due to the presence of a third concealed spell, which served to temporarily mitigate the changes in the atmosphere, including alterations in smells and sounds. The spell proved to be of limited utility in the short term, yet it ultimately proved detrimental to their long-term situation. Turning around to direct the hunters, the second-in-command did not realize that he had made the same mistake as his former superior. The subject had significantly underestimated the capabilities of the top-ranked werewolf, who was already undergoing another transformation to her partial shifted appearance. The following is Theron's point of view. The opening ceremony for the new school year was held. Approximately 1 week prior, he was asked whether he would be delivering the speech to this year's new students at the Royal Academy. Depending on his schedule, in the 70 years of his reign, he typically delivered it himself. However, he was currently inundated with professional obligations. The duration of the phenomenon was seemingly infinite. The budget for the subsequent year was in disarray, and as the year drew to a close, the number of reports pertaining to rogue problems continued to escalate. Moreover, it was imperative to examine the cash flow and new investments from his companies, program the subsequent meeting for the Pax Alphas, and address other pressing concerns. Despite the temporal constraints that precluded the possibility of respiration, he encountered an additional predicament. The council persistently and consistently expressed their desire for an heir, leveraging any available opportunity to do so. To be candid, it would have been more appropriate for those individuals to attend to their personal affairs. However, each time one of them approached him regarding a matter, they would not depart until posing another question about the issue. On each occasion, the inquiry was made, the subject's reflections invariably gravitated toward a particular and aesthetically pleasing scene that had been witnessed by the subject in a prior instance at the airport, and this occurred without any deliberate intention on the part of the subject. Initially, he found her to be a subject of interest, consequently, he reviewed her dossier. Subsequently, he viewed the video of the altercation, which left him unable to speak, and he felt that she was even more intriguing. The female subject in the video appeared to be equally matched with the other werewolves during the initial phase of the altercation. While her level of engagement was not particularly high, it was evident that her maneuvers were precise and effective. It was evident that the subject demonstrated a high level of proficiency in evading the majority of the werewolves that attempted to engage her. She exhibited a remarkable ability to maintain control of the situation, effectively deterring the assailants with ease. Subsequently, when the werewolf who appeared to be her associate was injured, she rescued him with great haste. This action, incidentally, provoked feelings of irritation in him. Subsequently, she swiftly shifted her position, adopting an offensive stance. He then reflected on the nature of the offense. Her maneuvers appeared to be executed at such rapid speeds that it was as if he were observing himself engaged in combat. Following her participation in the contest, he periodically reflected on her performance. The question arises as to what factors might contribute to the profound sadness experienced by such a formidable wolf and the remarkable resilience exhibited by the seemingly delicate girl. These thoughts were in constant flux. Subsequently, he began to contemplate the phenomenon that a person who appeared to be on the verge of tears and did not appear to have undergone any cosmetic enhancement could nevertheless exude an aesthetic allure. The process of conceptualization gradually accelerated, with thoughts accumulating in a gradual and incremental manner. In recent times, the situation has escalated to the point where he even experiences dreams about her. It was not possible for him to experience even a brief period of respite without his thoughts inevitably turning to her countenance. It is noteworthy that, despite the absence of recognition from Dusk, the wolf, the subject continued to refer to the female wolf. He had previously inquired of the wolf whether she was his mate, speculating that Dusk might be able to sense the connection to her more readily than he could himself. However, the latter had stated that he did not recognize her wolf. Initially, Theron anticipated that this would be the conclusion of the matter. However, Dusk persisted in mentioning her physical attractiveness and her exceptional dance moves, which mirrored his internal reflections. Could it be that his wolf no longer prioritized locating a suitable mate, akin to the aforementioned subjects? Upon hearing of the speech, Dusk exhibited a marked increase in his level of affection, which he expressed through purring. He made a strong case for attending the event and informed Theron that there was a possibility of Elara being present at the ceremony. The subject, a wolf of considerable size and black fur, was the alpha of the pack. His transformation was a source of great concern for the other wolves, who exhibited a fear response. In the subject's mind, the alpha was now behaving in a manner reminiscent of a young wolf, displaying nervous behavior. Initially, he was inclined to decline the request for a speech, even informing Oren that the time was not conducive to such an event. This decision was influenced by Dusk's persistent objections. However, at the moment the beta was about to exit his office, he had a change of heart and concluded that he should still find time to deliver the speech. Indeed, it was widely anticipated that he would take part in the events commemorating the New Year's commencement. During the ceremony, prior to ascending the stage, he maintained his gaze upon the audience from the rear of the stage. He was concealed in the rear of the group, and he had also obscured his aura, so that the majority of werewolves were unable to perceive him. After scanning the room, he encountered her once more after a brief interval. It must be acknowledged that she exhibited distinctive characteristics that set her apart from other werewolves. She was positioned centrally within the cohort of Moonlight students. It is hypothesized that the subjects must have utilized the pack link to communicate, as their expressions exhibited changes over time, suggesting that they were engaged in discourse. It was evident that the subjects were attempting to suppress their laughter. Elara exhibited the most composure, yet even she was unable to prevent a slight smile from appearing on her face. As Theron was proceeding from behind the stage, he observed the aforementioned sight. This observation was relayed to him by one of the teachers, who indicated that the hall was at capacity. With due consideration, it must be noted that the latter had also inquired as to whether the individual was prepared to deliver the designated speech. He observed that the beautiful girl he had encountered only once at the airport, the one whose image persistently occupied his thoughts until he was nearly driven mad each day, now possessed a slight smile. The contrast between her rosy, healthy countenance and the melancholic expression she had exhibited at the airport was striking, prompting his heart to beat even more rapidly than it had previously. Throughout this period, he had presumed that he would swiftly consign her to oblivion. He had aspired to this outcome, yet her melancholic countenance impeded his ability to do so. As he delivered the annual address and subsequently encountered her in a setting characterized by formality, he anticipated that this would serve as a mental diversion from his thoughts concerning her. However, he found himself in a precarious situation, as her current face possessed an even more distinctive and memorable quality. The subject inhaled deeply, attempting to fill his lungs to capacity. Despite this effort, he found himself unable to avert his gaze. After an extended period, he finally ascended the stage, and while awaiting his introduction, he attempted to regain his composure. His Highness, the King of all Werewolves, Theron J. Wolfe. The presentation was facilitated by a member of the teaching faculty. And precisely as anticipated, each individual present in the room promptly rose from their respective seats and performed a bow. They were only permitted to raise their heads and assume a seated position when he granted them permission. "Kindly raise your head and take a seat." He attempted to avert his gaze from Elara, having found himself unable to do so, and thus continued to observe her. He was apprehensive that maintaining prolonged eye contact with her might cause her discomfort. Despite his status as the supreme werewolf, it is reasonable to assume that he would prefer to avoid prolonged visual contact. It is noteworthy that the collective attention of the individuals present in the expansive chamber was directed towards him. Upon further observation, it would become evident that his gaze was fixed intently on a female student, as the conspicuousness of his stare would suggest. It is a rather absurd scenario to imagine a man of 100 years of age losing his composure due to the actions of a mere 22-year-old woman. He was particularly apprehensive about the possibility of his closest confidant, Elias, becoming aware of the situation. The individual in question had endeavored, in conjunction with the members of the council, to persuade the subject to select any female individual as a queen, with the objective of ensuring the propagation of the species. Should he become aware of this situation, or should it come to the attention of the other members of the council, it is certain that he would face significant repercussions. It is conceivable that the individual in question would resort to the utilization of the aforementioned female's accommodations for personal use. It is evident that she was affiliated with a group of high-ranking werewolves and a student of Moonlight, which likely imposed certain constraints on their actions. This prompted a complex emotional response, characterized by a simultaneous sense of relief and disappointment. It is important to note that the subject in question expressed feelings of disappointment. However, the reason for this sentiment remains unclear. It is imperative that he regain his composure. The subject exhibited a single cough, as if he had intended to clear his voice, and then proceeded to speak. Fortunately, he possessed sufficient eloquence and his discourse proceeded without incident. Approximately 2 hours later, the opening ceremony reached its conclusion. It had been quite challenging to avert his gaze, but ultimately, he succeeded, albeit with great effort. He intermittently surveyed her presence, ensuring that his glance also encompassed the surrounding individuals to mitigate any potential emphasis on her alone. However, upon observing her departure with her pack, he experienced a profound sense of loss. He expressed a desire to prolong his time in her company. A mere additional second sufficed. "Your Highness, would you care to join me for dinner?" Elias, the friend, inquired with a smile, just as the subject was contemplating the subsequent course of action. He had initially intended to rebuff the man, perceiving him as one capable of penetrating his thoughts. However, a particularly ingenious notion struck him, compelling him to relinquish his initial refusal. Indeed, a considerable amount of time has elapsed. Furthermore, it is recommended that the instructor extend invitations to their students to attend. This event marks a notable milestone, as it is the first occasion in which such a substantial number of high-ranking moonlight werewolves have been present. "I would like to meet them." He endeavored to appear indifferent, as if the proposition was merely a suggestion and not a more substantial proposal. However, the individual in question had already narrowed his eyes and was meticulously studying the subject's face. However, merely observing the surroundings and attempting to avoid direct eye contact with her alone proved insufficient. It is reasonable to assume that he would now subject him to an inquisition. Very well. It is not uncommon to encounter the moonlight students. It is imperative to acknowledge the significance of this ritual and extend the privilege of partaking in the meal to these individuals. Elias concurred, signifying his agreement with a nod of affirmation. It was an anomalous occurrence that the boisterous individual had not harbored suspicions regarding him, and that the instructor had not inquired further. He has since departed to escort the students to his office. The conspicuous disinterest exhibited by Elias engendered skepticism in Theron, though it is conceivable that Elias's apparent indifference was merely a facade. For this, he expressed gratitude. It was not until a later point in the narrative that the protagonist became aware of the fact that Elias had been privy to his innermost thoughts. This revelation came to light when Elias finally divulged his feelings for the protagonist to his confidant. The latter would persist in teasing him, suggesting that he had been aware from the moment he observed Theron's gaze upon her during the ceremony, and this teasing would persist indefinitely. While awaiting their arrival in his office, the sensation of time passing was exacerbated by the perception that the wait was seemingly interminable. After an extended period that felt like an eternity, the students of Moonlight, accompanied by Elias, finally arrived in the hallway. Her distinctive scent and presence were readily discernible among the others. From the moment she entered the room, he refrained from glancing up from his documents. He awaited their arrival and the subsequent abatement of his agitation. Thereafter, he proceeded to vacate his desk and take a seat on the couch. The subject initiated the interaction with a formal introduction, a logical approach that ensured the opportunity to receive auditory input from the target individual. Elara Quinn's utterance was characterized by a combination of shyness and a slight stuttering tremor in her voice. This physical manifestation, however, served only to augment her appeal, contributing to an overall enhancement of her likability and charm. Her countenance, which had hitherto been devoid of expression, abruptly assumed a rosy hue, and her aesthetic appeal was such that it left the observer awestruck. The utterance of the name Elara by her voice, resonating like a whisper, was perceived as a source of profound emotional resonance, evoking a sensation of profound affection that culminated in a sensation of tingling in the heart. The utterance of the name Elara by her was reminiscent of the sound of bells, resonating in a delicate and melodious manner. Subsequently, upon directing her gaze toward him, it appeared that his fate was sealed. It is evident that immediate departure following the ceremony would have been the most logical course of action. It would have been more prudent for him to depart and refrain from any future interactions with her, as at this juncture, he felt as if he had voluntarily embarked on a journey to the underworld, with no possibility of escape. This marked the first instance in his life that he experienced love, and it was characterized by its profound and overwhelming nature. A beeping sound is audible. The heart monitor was gradually becoming audible. A standard heart rate should be considerably faster than this. The interval between heartbeats on this monitor was excessively prolonged. The sensation of each heartbeat was perceived as a culmination of all that had preceded it. A beeping sound is audible. Her entire body was covered with bandages, and she had numerous lacerations and contusions. Her face was pale, almost white. Her lips exhibited signs of cracking, her cheeks had lost their color, and her eyes did not show any indication of opening. The incident occurred 3 days prior, yet she had not exhibited any indications of awakening. A beeping sound is audible. Her heart rate exhibited a precipitous increase. With each heartbeat, he experienced a concurrent emotional warming, which was followed by a subsequent emotional freeze when her heartbeats were not detected in a timely manner. The subject's attention was completely oriented towards the auditory stimulus. This subject was of the utmost importance to him. The subject had not slept since he discovered the female subject. His typical, well-groomed appearance had been altered, becoming disheveled. The subject's hair was no longer meticulously groomed, and his formerly unlined face had become obscured by the emerging stubble and the dark, creased skin around his eyes. The patient's activities were limited to showering, with no evidence of any other physical activity. The hospital's location within the palace compound proved to be a fortuitous circumstance, as it obviated the need for extensive movement on his part. Consequently, he would conduct intermittent observations throughout the day, thereby facilitating the investigation of the underlying cause of the attack. The act of trespassing into his domain and attempting to abduct his subjects was a grave transgression that merited the most severe sanction, death. It was evident that the individual's trepidation had dissipated. 3 decades had elapsed since the previous armed conflict. Ultimately, the populace came to recognize both his name and his brutality. The mere utterance of his name was sufficient to elicit a state of trepidation among those who bore witness to it. It is noteworthy that he had, in fact, vanquished the same number of rogues and other supernatural entities as his army, acting alone. It is possible that the relevant parties have since become oblivious to this fact. It is imperative that he establish a precedent for the individuals responsible for the recent attack. The majority of individuals who had committed trespassing acts had perished. Tragically, one individual had evaded detection and successfully traversed the borders. However, he had discovered 2 individuals while they were attempting to depart from the forest, and they were currently being detained for interrogation prior to their scheduled execution. The identification of leads was imminent. It is evident that an operation of such audacity would not be overseen by the individuals present in the forest. It is evident that the subjects were not operating alone. Examining her countenance in close proximity to his own, as he found himself doing with each subsequent observation, he noted that her beauty remained unchanged. The girl, who appeared to be of delicate health, had successfully rescued all of her pack members. Notwithstanding the presence of wolfsbane in her system, she did not succumb to its effects, a phenomenon that perplexed the attending physicians, given the sufficient quantity of the substance in her body to potentially fatal levels for 2 or 3 higher-ranked werewolves. Upon his arrival at the castle on the eve of the attack, he was immediately overwhelmed by the pervasive sense of blood and combat. His heightened senses immediately detected a disturbance in the forest, so, leaving no explanations to the assistants behind him, he transformed into his wolf and ran towards the forest. The olfactory cues from the scene of the crime were readily discernible, as the scent of blood intensified with each advance. Consequently, he arrived at the site of the attack with remarkable alacrity. In this location, he observed werewolves immobilized on their knees, surrounded by the corpses of human hunters, including dismembered body parts. A short distance behind the aforementioned subject was observed to be the presence of the individual in question. A considerable quantity of blood was observed on her attire, obscuring the visibility of their original coloration. Her facial features and tresses exhibited a similar discoloration, as if pigmented with a crimson dye. As she remained motionless, he observed that her eyes were as dark as night and that her hand, which was positioned on Iron Fang's neck, was equipped with sharp, elongated claws. The subject had undergone a partial transformation, with her wolf exhibiting dominant characteristics. However, this sight did not evoke fear in him, on the contrary, he was mesmerized by her composure and intrepidity. She stood proudly, seemingly indifferent to her injuries, as she broke the Iron Fang's neck. Subsequently, succumbing to the discomfort, her ocular pigmentation reverted to its original chocolate hue, her fangs and claws reverted to their typical appearance, and she gradually closed her eyes as she succumbed to the ground. It was at this juncture that he perceived the heartbreak. The sensation of emotional distress was novel and unprecedented, as he had never before experienced such a profound level of discomfort. The emotional impact of this event was so profound that it was akin to the dissolution of his heart into a multitude of fragments. It would be a curious phenomenon if those who previously asserted that his heart was impervious to injury were to discover the ease with which it could be broken. It was determined that there was no further risk to the other werewolves, who were beginning to move. Given the certainty of Oren's imminent arrival, as observed following a brief interval, the decision was made to depart from the location with her on his back, directing the group towards the Royal Hospital. Despite the immediate response of the medical professionals upon observing the king, and their assurance of providing the highest standard of care to the female werewolf that had been conveyed to the emergency room by the king, he nevertheless mandated that all doctors present provide her with the utmost care. In the event of her demise, he pledged that they would share her destiny. Despite their best efforts, they informed him that the amount of wolfsbane in her system was lethal. The subject's inability to comprehend the phenomenon of the subject's continued survival was striking. He vociferously admonished them, his dark eyes betraying an apparent inclination to inflict harm. The subject's intimidating presence instilled a sense of subservience, compelling those present to genuflect and expose their necks as a gesture of deference. The attending medical professionals had engaged in deliberations for a period of 3 hours in order to determine the most appropriate course of action. During this time, 2 or 3 younger doctors had remained by her side, providing minimal support for her survival. However, as the team conducted a thorough analysis of her blood, along with the concentration of wolfsbane present, the findings were not entirely favorable. I require answers from you, solutions, nothing else. The next to inform me that she will perish before her. The man's demeanor shifted, and he began to lose his composure, raising his voice in a manner that was both audible and disruptive to those present. The Alpha's recent actions have garnered significant recognition within the medical community. Specifically, she has been lauded for her role in saving 49 werewolves independently. The Moonlight Alpha will not be terminated. It is imperative that the relevant parties are apprised of any solution that may be proposed. Oren's timely intervention, having arrived shortly earlier with other assistants, was instrumental in resolving the situation. Had he not done so, the Beta feared that there would be no doctors left to treat Elara in a few more seconds. Your Highness, I have devised a solution. One of the younger doctors articulated in a stuttering manner. That approach is not viable. As previously mentioned, her blood type does not correspond to any of the documented werewolf samples, and even if it did, the risk to the other party involved would be too high. The response was provided by another physician who was examining the younger individual, and he expressed a strong desire to strangle him. The subject was instructed to cease speaking. Theron employed his alpha voice, which induced a state of fear in the older doctor, rendering him incapable of articulating a response. Now you. I would appreciate an elaboration on the subject. He uttered his words in a detached manner, his tone devoid of warmth, yet his authority unmistakable. His gaze fixed intently on the young physician, his words carrying a weight that was palpable even without the need for verbal emphasis. The wolfsbane in the Alpha's blood has the highest level of toxicity in it that has ever been observed. Wolfsbane, a substance employed by human hunters, is typically derived from the flowers of the plant. This is due to the fact that the human users of wolfsbane are also slightly toxic, and the wolfsbane is subsequently utilized to create bullets that are infused with this substance. Therefore, despite the fact that the sap from its root exhibits a higher degree of toxicity, it is never utilized in weapons due to its capacity to be lethal even to humans. The toxicity level of the substance in question is so high that, if we were to consider it, it would take 4 wolfsbane bullets to kill one high-ranking werewolf with the 3rd rank. Normally, with the wolfsbane made from its roots, it would take only 2 bullets. It is unfortunate that the Alpha has been exposed to this particular, more noxious iteration of wolfsbane. Please proceed directly to the point, Doctor. It is evident that my patience is waning. I do not have the time to dedicate to a comprehensive course on wolfsbane. Theron acknowledged the complexity of the situation, while concurrently endeavoring to restrain Dusk from escalating beyond manageable levels. I am approaching the point you indicated, Your Highness. I would like to elaborate on the potential risks involved. He articulated these sentiments with a steady voice. In the presence of the physician's confidence, and cognizant that he was the sole individual willing to provide a solution, Theron refrained from interrupting and allowed the physician to continue speaking. Another issue is that we have never observed such atypical reactions to wolfsbane in her system. Despite the administration of blood transfusions to reduce the levels of wolfsbane in her system, there has been only a minimal decrease in the levels of the toxin, despite the significant blood loss resulting from the 7 gunshot wounds. Despite the implementation of multiple transfusions, there has been only a marginal improvement in her condition. Despite extensive efforts, it has not been possible to induce the body to resume its own regeneration. The prolonged duration required for the transfusions is likely to result in a fatal outcome before the completion of the treatment. The proposed solution entails the linkage of another werewolf's blood flow to that of the subject. In order for her blood to circulate in the other werewolf's blood, it is imperative that both werewolves reach a state of equilibrium in terms of toxicity levels. This process is gradual and incremental, with the objective being a reduction in toxicity levels. The presence of two bodies would reduce the time required for the regeneration process to recommence by half. It is imperative that the task be completed. He asserted that her recovery was of paramount importance. The attending physician has expressed reservations regarding the proposed solution. Initially, it is imperative to acquire a werewolf of equivalent rank to that of the subject in question. The toxicity level present in her bloodstream is certain to result in the demise of the other werewolf if a less formidable specimen is utilized. In the event that the werewolf is ranked below even a single rank, there exists the possibility that the werewolf will sustain severe damage or even perish. With regard to the alpha, it is possible that he could inflict further bodily harm upon her if his ranking is higher, or that we could expend our time and, more crucially, her remaining time, if his ranking is lower. According to the documentation obtained from the Academy, she is designated as a third-rank individual. However, it is evident that an error occurred during the testing process. As previously mentioned, werewolves ranked third would have perished by this point. It is evident that she is ineligible for this rank. Secondly, the subject's blood type is unique and extremely uncommon. A thorough review of our records, which encompass the majority of the kingdom's population data, has identified only one other werewolf with a matching blood type. However, the individual in question. He made this statement with a gaze that conveyed a clear intention, directing it towards Theron. An inquiry will be made of the instructor who supervised the seer examination to ascertain whether any irregularities occurred. With regard to the second issue, it is imperative to ascertain which individuals possess the same blood type. Regardless of their identity, it is certain that these individuals will exhibit a willingness to cooperate. Your Highness. It is noteworthy that her blood type is identical to that of the subject. Knock, knock. Elias rapped on the conference room's door at the Royal Hospital. He had a strong suspicion that he would be called. In the recent attack, a young woman who had been documented as a third-rank individual exhibited remarkable resilience, successfully resisting the effects of 2 spells, annihilating an entire group of heavily armed hunters, and evading multiple wolfsbane bullets. Despite the evident challenge she faced in maintaining her survival, her accomplishment was one that transcended her customary standing by a considerable margin. In the event of encountering a similar circumstance, he harbored significant reservations about his ability to maintain his survival. The potency of a wolf, Canis lupus, is contingent on its role within the pack. Some wolves serve as a diversionary tactic, while others engage in direct combat. The remaining wolves play a coordinating and directive role, orchestrating the progression of the battle. As a member of the investigative team and an educator, he had previously conducted interviews with the students present at the scene. He was made aware of her considerable speed and strength. Despite sustaining 7 gunshot wounds, which initially led to the hunter's belief that she had perished, she demonstrated a remarkable resilience, regaining consciousness and displaying a heightened degree of ferocity and strength. In a brief interval, she successfully dismembered and killed the majority of the hunters present at the location. However, she miscalculated the trajectory of 2 hunters, who lost consciousness, and 1, who fled upon witnessing the massacre. This signified that she had formulated and executed a strategy independently, without the assistance of her pack. The diversion, the coordination of attacks, and the execution of attacks were all carried out by a single werewolf. Her fierceness evoked a sense of familiarity, as if he had previously witnessed such formidable and unrelenting assaults. "Please enter." A commanding and authoritative voice was employed. The individual responsible for inducing the subject's sense of familiarity subsequently summoned him within the premises. This is precisely the thought process that occurred to him. The renowned barbaric assaults were, in fact, the domain of His Highness's expertise. The encounter was a fleeting one, as the last time he had observed the individual in combat was several decades prior. He exhaled and opened the door. The subject now faced the challenge of ascertaining the most effective method by which to apprise His Highness of his knowledge regarding Elara, while concurrently ensuring his own safety. Elara's directive to conceal her rank remained in effect, thereby precluding him from disclosing her rank to Theron. Theron is tasked with posing the appropriate inquiry, while also employing his alpha voice. Conversely, if he were to engage in dishonesty, it would inevitably result in further complications. "Elias, what is Miss Quinn's actual rank, and why have you concealed it within the documents? It is imperative to articulate the truth or face the consequences." It is evident that the individual in question would not have the opportunity for any form of introductory remarks. Instead, it would be more prudent to address the crux of the issues directly, as posited by Elias. "What is your intended meaning, Your Highness? What are the implications of her ranking?" He was unable to articulate it directly, but the most evident solution at present was to take advantage of his friend's quick temper. In the event that the subject played dumb and redirected the inquiries back to Theron, it is possible that Theron would employ his alpha voice. It would be necessary for him to adopt a more obtuse demeanor, persistently posing questions to Theron until he was compelled to address the matter directly. After all, he was his friend. He had never used his alpha voice on him, but in the end, he would. "Please inform me of her current rank." Theron articulated his sentiments in a vocalization that Elias had anticipated, albeit at a more deliberate tempo. Elias' countenance exhibited a momentary expression of discomposure. Despite having been friends for decades, the author had never previously employed the alpha voice with the subject. It is probable that the author would employ the alpha voice with the subject following the posing of additional questions. This assertion is highly dubious. He reflected on the implications of this phenomenon. For Elara, the speaker employed his alpha voice exclusively following the initial 2 inquiries, which were articulated in succession, thereby evoking the impression of a single question. This would necessitate a re-evaluation of his friendship. It is hypothesized that Theron's companion is likely Elara. Subsequently, he entertained the notion that her apparent attraction to her might not be rooted in genuine sentiment, but rather, it could be attributed to a residual physical attraction stemming from their minimal interaction over the past few months. However, his recent outburst served to corroborate this assessment. Nevertheless, he experienced a sense of injustice. If Theron's current behavior, characterized by a lack of commitment to the girl, persists after securing her romantic involvement, it raises pertinent questions regarding the potential evolution of his conduct. The inquiry extends to the extent of whether the individual in question would relinquish his friendship with them entirely. The subject's soul experienced a profound sense of distress, yet his mouth continued to articulate words. "She possesses a fourth-rank wolf," he stated, then directed his gaze at Theron and proceeded to elaborate further. "It is also worth noting that she possesses a first-ranked one." The inquiry posed sought to ascertain the rationale behind the failure to accurately document the matter in question. Theron persisted in his interrogation, employing an assertive vocal tone, after a brief period of uncertainty. The subject of the study was taken aback by the findings, but first he sought to understand the motivation behind his loyal friend's fabrication. "The curse I am under, which restricts me from revealing information aside. A werewolf of a lower rank is bound by the directives of a higher-ranked werewolf. With the exception of the rogues, all werewolves adhere to this norm. In essence, she employed her alpha voice in my direction. I was compelled to conceal the truth and even fabricate a narrative." Elias replied with evident enthusiasm. It was at this juncture that Theron arrived at the realization that the sole factor contributing to Elias's willingness to articulate his thoughts was the employment of his alpha voice. Given his status as a first-ranked werewolf, akin to her own ranking, Elias was granted authorization to address the matter. Had others posed the question, the subject would have been unable to respond with veracity. "I am releasing the command she placed on you, albeit partially. It is permissible to articulate the findings from the seer test in question, however, this information must be disclosed exclusively to the undersigned. The authority of the aforementioned individual continues to extend to the others." Elias finally exhaled, experiencing a sense of relief. "At this point, I am able to articulate my perspective on the matter. I take responsibility for my failure to disclose this matter to you. Please specify the information you wish to be provided. On this occasion, I will offer a candid assessment. It is perplexing to observe that she is simultaneously ranked fourth and first. The inherent strength of a wolf is not subject to fluctuation, it can only undergo a slight increase through extensive training. However, it is not subject to variability." In contrast to his usual assertive demeanor, he opted for a more subdued approach, eschewing his customary alpha voice. The necessity of the object had been rendered obsolete. The aforementioned assertion is indeed substantiated by empirical evidence, as it has been demonstrated to exhibit a consistent and unvarying pattern. This assertion would be applicable if she were a solitary wolf. Elias's response was characterized by a high degree of candor. The existence of more than one wolf within a single body is a theoretical impossibility. There is always only one. Theron's expression conveyed a state of heightened perplexity. This is precisely how it typically manifests. I also found her assertion to be lacking in credibility. Therefore, I instructed her to present each wolf for the evaluation. On the first occasion, the orb revealed a fourth-rank wolf, on the second, a first-rank wolf. It is evident that the initial rank of the wolf is notably formidable. When I attempted to contact you to apprise you of the situation, she intervened and immediately halted the communication. It was not possible for me to disobey in any way. She even referred to me as pup. At my present age, I am being referred to as a pup. I am curious as to what physical characteristics might be associated with this term. Elias initiated his explanation, but his discourse deviated from the subject matter when he recollected the encounter. While he did not openly acknowledge it, he experienced significant distress, even resorting to nightmares. Elijah is advised to adhere strictly to the central theme of his discourse. The time available for this task is limited. The fundamental premise is that the possibility of two wolves is not fully understood, yet she possesses this understanding. The first-ranked one, for reasons that are not entirely clear, has chosen to maintain a position of profound obscurity within Elara's consciousness. This phenomenon can be attributed to the fact that her aura does not compel those in her proximity to submit to her authority. She possesses a more profound understanding of the rationale behind the existence of dual wolves than Elara, though she has not divulged this knowledge to Elara herself. If the assertion that she is a first-rank wolf is accurate, it raises the question of why she exhibited reluctance in confronting the hunters and failed to neutralize them more expeditiously. It is reasonable to hypothesize that a group of hunters numbering a couple dozen would pose a considerable challenge to a first-rank wolf. Theron, intrigued by this detail, inquired further. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.